to what will probably be the final presentation on Goffman. So we've been walking through the book fairly carefully. There really only remains chapter 5 on communication out of character, which is fairly self-explanatory, and then chapter 6, which is sort of the idea of the arts of impression management, which we'll talk about. I'll leave most of the conclusions for you to read on your own, and then I'll sort of wrap up myself here. I'll talk a little bit about the essay Roll Distance, and we're going to make some big claims about the way that the book relates to the rest of the course. So, Goffman, again, very readable, probably not a social theorist of the first rank. I think that you could be a very good sociologist and never deploy Goffman at all, but he is an excellent initiator into the world of sociological thinking. So as a mature adult sociologist, you may not need Goffman for very much. There's probably better people for almost everything Goffman does, but as a beginning student, he's very, very readable, and he really helps us become sociologists, people who think in terms of structure and so on. He's one of the first theorists I read all the way through. I read everything he wrote. I think everything he wrote in my first 2 years of graduate school at the University of Kansas. And so I became very enamored with his project. Later on, the limits became more apparent to me. But let's sort of walk through this, if we can, in kind of a rapid succession. In chapter 5, again, Goffman tries to sort of, now that he's sort of established that there's a distinction between the existential self and the performed self, right? The existential self and the performed self, which we have here in these great images from this 1978 French dance troupe. That there's a distinction. So the existential self is the performer that animates the masks, and the masks are actually social roles, right? Or performed selves, right? Yeah. And so to Goffman, once you establish that you're a multiplicity and that you have the problem as an existential self that's distinct from the problem as a performed self, it leads to all kinds of kind of interesting insights about society. So in this chapter, he really emphasizes that once you recognize that performed selves are animating multiple that existential selves are animating multiple performed selves, then you have to recognize that there is a lot of communication out of character. And so that's what this is about. So communication out of character primarily takes place in the front stage region, so in the region of the front where the audience is present. And it involves the following items. So number one is the treatment of the absent. So again, not all on the front stage. The treatment of the absence occurs in the backstage. It's informal. There's a lot of familiarity. So his argument is that when a performance team is away from its counterpart, from an audience, that the performance team will talk to each other or interact with each other in a familiar way, in a way that directly negates or contradicts the performance that just had happened. So one of the ways that this manifests itself is in the treatment of the absent. When the performance team is backstage, the audience is mocked, made fun of, and so on. And so this kind of negative treatment of the absent is part of the thing. And he claims that this is a way to build sort of team solidarity, ensure that the in-group, out-group boundaries are maintained with the performance team having loyalty with itself rather than with the other. And then it helps sort of, get rid of the negative stigma that might be attached to a poor performance, to shame and so on, by joking and getting rid of it that way. All right, so that's one form of communication out of character when the performance team is backstage and they mock and make fun of the performance and mock and make fun of the audience. Number two is staging talk. So this, again, occurs generally backstage in a position of informality. And it's where, the team is together talking about what needs to happen, how we can, do things better next time, performance, directions, those kinds of things. So that's a second type of communication out of character that would directly contradict the image that one has during a performance. Number three is team collusion. So this happens in the front during a performance when a performer, so you can imagine here, like in this scene, we have two performers enacting 6 performed selves, and you can imagine that the two existential selves, the two performers, talk to each other on stage or whisper to each other or signal cues to each other, that would be team collusion. So in the co-presence of the audience, the existential selves of the team members, performance team members, relate to each other as performers, thereby excluding the audience. And the audience can sometimes detect that we actually aren't, that these folks aren't doing their performance, so now acting as performers, right? All right. And then we're going to talk a little bit how this is going to have an instrumental role in role distance in just a minute. All right, so there it is. So every human being in modernity needs an audience to perform in front of and a performance team to be familiar with. You can't really be a full human being without both. You need a place to project your performed selves, because you really can't be a full self without that. And then you need a place to be intimate with other performers and that to be familiar, right? All right. And then again, he emphasizes that performances are not a spontaneous response to a situation. They're pre-scripted, they're pre-planned. It's a reenactment of an already existing situation. Hence, the definition of the situation that is projected by a performance team, right? The performance team projects the definition of the situation before an audience. That definition of the situation is not something that's made in the moment. It's something that's already what we would call, in Durkheimian terms, a collective representation. It's something that the group would know something of. It would be representative of an already existing cultural understanding. So you're going to project a lecture or project a play or project the play, Hamlet or something like that. You're going to know what it is that's being projected. So it isn't something spontaneously generated. It's something that's sort of strategically reenacted, okay? All right. So even though spontaneous psychological involvement is the goal of the performance, is to try to get people caught up in the situation in accordance with its definition, that this isn't something that happens automatically, but it's something that actually requires something like administrative or organizational work to have it happen. Okay, that's chapter 5. Chapter 6 is really a kind of, I don't know how to put it, a sort of contemplation of morality. So if you were to sort of rewrite the Ten Commandments, now that you've read Goffman, what would you want? So what would you want out of a performance team member, and what would you want out of an audience? And so it really distills pretty quickly. What you need out of a performance team are people who are good defensive players, who are good at protecting the definition of the situation and to enable the joint performance to unfold without hitch or without difficulty. So this requires loyalty, dramaturgical loyalty, to the team itself, which means that you keep your secrets and you protect the boundaries between the front and the back, keep the audience out, and between the in and the out, keeping outsiders away as well, not sharing secrets and those kind of things. And again, this helps prevent sympathy from developing or too much between the audiences and the performers, and preventing, I suppose, the performers from going native and taking on the perspective of an audience member. So loyalty, where are your loyalties? Are you with us? Are you with them? If you're with them, we don't want you. We need people who are going to be loyal to the team. All right. Dramaturgical discipline. This simply means people need to know their lines and to know the blocking, where they're supposed to be, and have some capacity for self-control, self-management, to be dependable, to be ready to go. So that when the performance begins, the performance team members are, prepped and ready to do it. And then the last thing is something called dramaturgical circumspection, which really means that you want performance team members that are able to anticipate. It really is pointed to a psychological kind of being on your toes, being ready to jump in, to negate potential disruptions, or to stop problems from emerging. And in other words, you need a kind of strategic understanding of what is about to happen, of the likely disruptions, and have a kind of forethought plan, a forewarning almost, like, okay, if this happens, we know what we're going to do. So it's really this idea that you don't just perform, but you bring your full capabilities as a thinking, acting human being to bear on the performance. You're not just passively enacting a role, but you're actually, as an existential being, throwing yourself into the needs of the situation, anticipating it, and so on. So it's kind of like being a truly self-managed person in the context of this. So that's what you want a performance team member. You want them to be loyal, disciplined, and circumspect. Audience members, you need them to protect the unfolding performance. So that means what you really need more than anything else. Number one, they need to defend the boundaries of the in and the out, and respect the boundaries of the back and the front. You don't want outsiders in, and the audience is often essential to doing that. And then you don't want the backstage breached. And so, again, there's a kind of discipline there of staying out of that, a kind of respect for the performance as a kind of sacred thing that's set apart. All right, then you need tact. So what is tact? Well, tact is a kind of, civil, polite disattention to something that is potentially disruptive. So you want tact displayed regarding performances. So this means that you want, even if you're not interested in the performance, you're going to tactfully pretend as though you are. You're going to display polite. You're going to, quote, pay attention, like literally use your energy to contribute to the appearance that the performance is unfolding. Paying attention. You're not really attending. You're paying attention. You're actually using your energy and sort of sacrificing it for the performance. So you want people to pretend that they're paying attention even when they're not, and displaying that they are even when they're not. And then to ignore disruptions or flawed performances, to overlook things that would distract from the definition of the situation. And then you have to be tactful regarding tact. And I always like to tell students, it's like repression regarding repression. Repression doesn't work if you've known to repress something. It keeps coming out, it returns and bites at you. Well, the same thing with tact, that tact doesn't work. If the audience lets you know that they're only paying attention out of kindness or pity or something like that, the illusion that the definition of the situation is holding goes away. So you have to have tact regarding tact. You have to politely hide the fact that you're only politely paying attention. You have to politely hide the fact that you are politely overlooking flaws, that kind of thing. So tact regarding tact. And so this, in essence, is what we need modern people to be. If you're going to be moral in the modern world, these are the moral qualities of the individual. Okay, and so as he talks about, if you don't have this, then the whole performance breaks down. If the performance breaks down, you fall into what he calls elsewhere, negative experience, which means this experience of complete shame because you literally have lost yourself, you've been exposed, and so on. And both the audience and the performers do that. So if something goes awry, you're no longer a performer, right? You're seen as a sort of naked performer without a performed self in front of you. And again, it's like being caught naked or something. You feel very exposed and very vulnerable, that kind of thing. Okay, so let's hit, I've got 4 last points that are written down, and we're going to walk through these in terms. Number 1, I just want you to know, linking this book up to the rest of the course, that situations are structural things. Social roles are structural things. Situations are structural things. This means that social roles and situations are structured. That means that they're like bolted into the social structure of society itself. So the roles you have are bolted to the economy, they're bolted to the educational system, they're bolted to family structures and so on. And as we're going to talk about in the next unit when we get to Marx, the main thing that is determining where the bolts are and determining how the structure unfolds is capitalism, right? Capital. So in the end, these parts that you're playing aren't self-determined. They're not freely chosen to as much as we would like, but they're actually things that bear upon us. We have no choice but to play the role as worker in a capitalist economy or we die, right? So these social roles, again, aren't fun little things that are created for pleasure, but they're actually structurally linked to the basic sort of institutional arrangements of society. So this isn't silly. And Goffman, sometimes with his examples, it appears silly, but it isn't silly. Once you start thinking in terms of work and performance and getting good grades and getting ahead and keeping your job in an economic downturn and these kinds of things, the moral or seriousness of this comes across, right? All right, so the familiar actor is the unstaged self, is what you experience, when you're all alone and that kind of thing. But what you're generally worried about in your mind is how to play the role that structurally links you to pay, that structurally links you to, to the capacity to self-determine over time. So these things, so we're using our energy. That means then that we as performers, as social selves, as animals, as apes, are using our energy to animate these social roles, social masks, selves that are structurally predetermined and bolted to the capitalist society around us, okay? So again, this isn't silly, it's actually really serious, although Goffman often doesn't let us see that. All right, the second point is this idea of, Yeah, that you've got this real problem. Okay, yes. So if something goes awry with the definition of the situation, everybody feels it. The performance team and the audience both feel shame and experience something like negative experience, right? That the consequences for failed performances can be catastrophic. So for each of the selves and for society as a whole. So negative experience must be avoided, hence the show must go on, and that incredible kind of moral weight that's placed upon the need to do that. Now, what was the other point that's related to that? Yeah, the sense of shame and self-feeling that's linked to a failed performance. All right, so the next thing is this difficulty that modern performers have juggling the variety of masks. So every performer has an array of masks. We're going to talk about how, well, we'll just get to it right now. In the essay Role Distance, which we're not going to talk about, Goffman claims that these individual roles that you're playing, these different masks, are rarely congruent with each other. They're just simply an assemblage. So since we have to work in the economy, often the work role that we play is inconsistent with other roles that we play, family and other things. And even though it's all bolted together by capitalism, there really isn't any sort of person in charge or God in charge assigning you these roles. You simply must play them. Hence, there's a lot of discrepancies and difficulties associated with them. I actually have to leave and go to class in just a few moments, so I'll try to wrap this up really fast and then maybe do an augmented lecture. I'll tack a little bit of this onto the next point that we make. So in traditional societies and primitive societies, human beings had a material self, a body, an existential self, and if they had a social double at all, it was experienced as a soul. Traditional society, you might get a few differentiated social doubles, even a few different kinds of souls and so on, but again, most people don't have a great difficulty managing a variety of social roles. You're really linked into a kind of unified social structure with a kind of mono self. All right. In modernity, Goffman is really pointing to the difficulty that we as performers have, existential selves, have in managing and juggling, again, many, many selves at the same time, many of which are inconsistent with each other, many of which can only be sustained, the reality status can only be sustained by segregating audiences and so on. And so this real trouble of a performer, a self, sweating away, trying to keep their performances alive, meeting the obligations they have to all these bolted together performance teams, and hoping that they don't fail, right? So this real difficulty that we have with that. Okay, so that's the problem with the multiple selves. Okay, and then let's hit the last point about deference and demeanor. So Goffman is going to tell us that in social life, in an essay called Deference and Demeanor in the book Interaction Ritual, Goffman argues that most social structures aren't egalitarian. That means that the social roles that we play are actually hierarchical. That means that there are subordinate positions at the bottom that require the display of deference, that playing social roles in most structured hierarchies demands that in addition to playing our role, doing our task, we also display deference. So what is deference? Deference is simply the recognition of the superiority of the other. So this idea that we bow down before authority or respectfully submit to authority is something that we signal through our ceremonial functions, through our demeanor and so on, the way that we carry ourselves. On the other hand, there's something, so that's deference, we defer. And then there's something called demeanor. Demeanor is simply the superior status accepts and is prepped to accept the deference of subordinates. So you get locked into these, in addition to doing work, you get it locked into these displays of hierarchical differentiation. So here we have, superiors. There's more to this than meets the eye, but this idea that we have people who, in addition to doing work, are ceremonially displaying deference, and that this is an additional part of our modern self. All right, so the last concept I want to get to is the concept of role distance. This is described in a book called Encounters. I'm not going to have time to go through it in detail here, but it's sort of an offcut of presentation of self in everyday life. My book is literally falling apart. Role distance. Anyway, What Goffman tells us in this essay correctly that many of the roles that we play are not self-chosen, they're forced on us. We are structurally predetermined to play certain roles. And in order to do that, those roles actually, again, limit us. The mask is adhered to the face. So here we are. So this is an image that I drew from the film Alien. And so the evil monster in Alien is a face hugger, right? It manifests itself as this, it comes out of John Hurt's stomach and then attaches to his face or something, correct? Maybe I get that wrong. Not quite right. But anyhow, the idea that the social roles that we have adhere to us. And once you get that idea that social structures force us to wear roles, force us to be in roles that we may not self-choose, that means that those roles impinge upon us and actually take us over. So the mask isn't just an inert thing that we animate with our energy. The mask itself is loaded with social energy that comes to us from the structural arrangements to which that mask is bolted. And it comes into us and actually takes us over. And so many of the roles that we play, for example, are stigmatizing. I worked at McDonald's in high school, and it's a stigmatizing thing to stink of French fries and of Big Mac sauce and so on, and to wear the goofy outfits that McDonald's workers had to wear that I wore for a couple of years. Very stigmatizing, right? And so that role had a kind of capacity to just sort of overtake the person. And it's very hard to remove that role. In the same way, it's hard to remove the stink of being, say, a person who rips hogs apart in a meatpacking plant. Hard to get that stink off, hard to get that mask off. It takes us over and overwhelms us. So in the film Alien, then, the mask of the alien is alive. It's not just an inert thing. It's loaded with energy, social energy that's far greater than the energy of the performer that is taken over by the part, right? There's a lot of horror films that sort of have that logic to it, right? Of a part that takes you over, the shoes that you put on and that dance you to death, that kind of thing. All right, so you put on these roles and they're constraining. You can't play other roles while you have that one on. So knowing that many roles are stigmatizing, especially economic roles, that they're stigmatizing, we actually use our energy not just to pick up and animate masks, but we use our energy to keep them at a distance. And that's what this is trying to depict. The energy of the human being that again, part of your existential self wants to make sure that those masks don't stick. So if you're in a play and you play an evil person, you don't want to be typecast as an evil person, and you don't want to be taken as an evil person in everyday life, right? You want to keep it away. Alan Rickman, the man who played Snape, Severus Snape, famously said at one point, like people would come up to him and spit on him in public, because they thought he, the actor, had the qualities that he exhibited in the part of Severus Snape, right? This evil man, or at least apparently evil man. So he had to actively distance himself from that. And you'll see actual professional actors do that. They'll take quirky parts or parts that are against type to keep them from being too strongly typecast and associated with the part that they play. I could talk more about that. There's much more to say, but I must leave. So I may wrap up a little bit more. I think the main thing I want you to know is that Goffman's silly little examples and his kind of cute phrasing and sort of hyper accessibility makes him readable. His lack of careful references and citation of people who came before, in other words, his pretense that he's the first human being to ever talk about these matters, is very unscholarly. He couldn't get published today. Many of these articles just simply wouldn't go. They're too literary. They don't have the kind of heft of scholarship, right? And so again, it makes it readable, and it makes it seem pretty interesting and self-contained, but it isn't sort of it isn't an accurate depiction of scholarship. And Goffman is sort of a master at making himself appear much more original than he actually was. And again, like the originality of his work goes away when you really begin to read the other people who were linked to him and really go back and like read Hegel and others who were writing about mass and performances and characters and so on long before he ever did. So in my judgment, as a professional sociological theorist, especially as a critical theorist, he's a second-rate guy. But as a student of sociology, including me as a young student of sociology, he's accessible, interesting, and the cute little examples really do capture you, and you can begin to see how society impedes upon you and forces you to play roles that you don't want in other things very early. And then you can take Goffman and just with slight twists, right, reconnect it back up to capitalism and to roles that we play that have real seriousness to them. And then his work actually could be quite critical and quite powerful and quite important. The concept of role distance, again, that these things impede on us and we have to force them away, really important. And then as we're going to talk about a little bit in the next section, deference and demeanor, that we use our energy not just to do work, but to display deference to power and to accept the deference of others, right? To display that we're excellent or something is good. With that, I must go. Hope this helped.